The Pacific is the second installment in the unofficial trilogy of shows which consist of Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and Masters of the Air. Released in 2010, it aired 9 years after Band of Brothers took the world by storm, and with it being a huge success, The Pacific was predicted to replicate what its predecessor did. However, that wasn't necessarily the case. Regardless of it not being able to reach the heights of Band of Brothers, The Pacific is still an incredible piece of television, and something that I get great enjoyment from when watching. Whether that be because of the budget it had, the visuals, the telling of the true story, or the fact that it showcased a theatre of war that doesn't necessarily come to the front of mind when thinking of the Second World War. It's a great show, and I thought it was only right to start breaking it down alongside Band of Brothers, so I won't hold off any longer. Here is a breakdown of the first episode of The Pacific. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The overview and interviews. This first episode opened up in a similar way to Band of Brothers, but there was a slightly different opening. At the time of The Pacific being filmed, we were fortunate enough to be able to have some veterans alive who were able to be interviewed, so it meant that there could still be that sense of grounding, connecting, and understanding of people that actually went through what we were seeing being depicted on screen. Something which I think makes a huge impact, even though it is only ever a minute or so at the beginning. As well as the interviews, there was also a brief overview of the time period, which was voiced over by Tom Hanks. Personally, I don't know if I like the fact that it was Tom Hanks that was doing the voiceover. He's got such a distinguishable voice that I almost would have liked it to have been one of the main characters that we later went on to follow, Leckie, Sledge, or Basilone. I think I would have liked that more because it would have felt like it was more from the perspective of the people that we were following. As this was the first episode, there weren't too many specifics that were spoken about by the veterans in the interview. It was more of an overview and a broader scope. For example, it was said that it was a nasty war and it still scared them to this day. There's something about the Pacific theatre that does feel very different to fighting in mainland Europe. I'm not saying one is more scary than the other because it would be terrifying to be involved in either. But going to a terrain that was so different to anything you would have experienced before, where there were weather conditions that were just relentless, temperatures that were unfamiliar, and in a jungle where there was almost no respite, I imagine it's something that's purely nightmare-inducing even several decades after the war was finished. Being able to hear from the veterans is something that even with the smallest of sentences, it just provides an extra bit of clarity and just puts what we see into perspective. Being able to hear directly from them is something that's amazing, because it can't really be done anymore, so I'm glad the show went with that approach with The Pacific. December 1941. The first time we saw the story develop, it was December 1941 and it was within the USA. We were introduced to Bob Leckie at a church where he bumped into Vera, and he mentioned that he'd joined the Marines and was going to write to Vera whilst he was in the Pacific. The real-life Bob Leckie was born in 1920 in Philadelphia to an Irish Catholic family and grew up in Rutherford, New Jersey. The encounter with Leckie was relatively brief, but I'm presuming they had him in the church to give us the understanding that he came from a religious background and family, and also to show us Vera, who eventually goes on to be an important figure in his life. After this, we were then introduced to Basilone, JP, and Manny. They were listening to Colonel Chesty Puller as he was briefing the Marine Corps on what they were going to be doing, stating how they were fighting for the freedom of the world and wanting to prevent its enslavement. Puller mentioned how the Pacific would be the theatre for their war, and that everything that was going on in Europe wasn't necessarily their problem to think about, as they were going off to the Pacific. The final shot that we had in this scene was of Basilone looking at the map and gauging an understanding of where it was that he was going to be going. The real-life John Basilone enlisted in the United States Army in 1934, and he did a 3-year enlistment in the Philippines. This was something which was mentioned by his brother in the scene that took place at the family dinner. After he was released from duty and returned home working as a truck driver, he enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1940, which is where he then eventually was sent to Guantanamo Bay and then eventually Guadalcanal, which is what we saw in the show. The dinner that took place, which had John Basilone, JP, and Manny, was one which was actually quite a haunting one. It had the whole family together, but when John's brother did a speech and mentioned how in 1 year's time they wanted to sit down again for a welcome home feast with everybody there, the mood just dropped. This is because not all of them would be there in a year's time. And then also, later on in the season, when we revisited the Basilone house in the finale, the mood couldn't be different to what it was in that first episode. That's all I could think about when the brother gave his speech. It was one so full of life, laughter, happiness, and optimism, but by the end, it was far from that. When comparing Leckie's farewell to the Basilone's family farewell, John and his father were looking into each other's eyes, they shared a smile, and were also holding each other's hands. Whereas with Leckie, his father dropped him at the bus station, but he was relatively absent. He was more focused on fixing his car rather than actually seeing his son off, because it could well have been the last time that he saw him. I do wonder why that was the case, but I'm going to presume that maybe it was just a generational thing. Not much affection was probably shown at that time amongst certain generations, and also maybe his father was distracting his own mind because he was actually fearful of what was going to happen to his son. Because the moment that Leckie said to him that he was going, they then shared a handshake and bid each other farewell, and then his father said, "Goodbye, son," something which felt quite final and conclusive. After this, we then met the third character and perspective that we go on to see the story being told from, and this is Eugene Sledge. Eugene was a young man and wasn't able to go off to war because he had a medical condition. He had a heart murmur, and his father, the doctor, didn't want him to go. However, we later found out that there were also other reasons for his father's reluctance, but at this moment in time, Sledge was just devastated over the fact that many people that he knew were going off to fight for their country and he couldn't do so. This was also reiterated later on in the episode when Sid received a letter from him where he expressed those exact feelings again. This whole first section was about showing us 3 different perspectives that we're going to be witnessing the Pacific from. Within Band of Brothers, there were multiple different perspectives. Each episode kind of had its own character leading the story, but within this show, it's 3 consistent perspectives all of the time: Leckie, Basilone, and Sledge. Guadalcanal, August 7th, 1942. One major difference between the Pacific and Band of Brothers, which was made most apparent in the first episode, was the jump in time within an episode. Within Band of Brothers, the first episode was obviously set 2 years in the past, and it then jumped forward to D-Day. But on no other occasion was there any large jump in a period of time partway through an episode. Within the Pacific, it jumped from December 1941 to August 1942, where the boys were getting ready to go to Guadalcanal whilst on the ship. Obviously, the Pacific needs to have these jumps because it's set over several years, when compared to Band of Brothers, which pretty much spans the duration of 1 year, so the large jumps aren't required as much. Within Guadalcanal, one thing that was particularly interesting when the men were on the boat was the fact that they didn't really have any clear understanding of what it was that they were going to be doing out there. All they knew was that they needed to kill the Japanese troops, which were the enemy, but they didn't really have any kind of understanding why. The act of almost having some kind of Last Supper, the final meal before the electric chair, as was mentioned, was something that did feel very apparent. When the men were leaving the ship and getting onto the boats to take them to shore, this was a moment where it felt like it was almost going to be like what it was when the beaches were stormed in Normandy. And the way that the scene was structured, it very much felt like that too. There was tension that was built, close-up shots of people's faces in fear as they didn't know where they were heading towards, as they were told to keep their heads down low. There were people vomiting, and people being frightened was something that was definitely there. However, all of that built-up tension within that scene didn't amount to anything, because the beaches were clear and there was no immediate threat for them when they got there. Following this scene, we had quite a few minutes of just watching them navigating through the jungle and the terrain. This was something that I really appreciated because it allowed us to see just how different the environment was when compared to the European battles in World War II. The environment was something that it seemed like they were fighting against. Plus, it also felt like if you were more familiar with the terrain, then it would prove to be advantageous. During this patrol that they were doing, they stumbled across some men that had been absolutely butchered by the Japanese soldiers. This was actually a haunting sight to look at. The remains of the individuals had their eyes gouged out, plus things put into their mouths. It felt like it was done to show just how brutal the Japanese soldiers could be during World War II. It was documented that they apparently carried out acts of cannibalism, the slaughtering and starvation of prisoners of war, and the murder of non-combatants. So this scene painted a haunting picture for sure. Within the scene during that evening, the medic called Lewis was killed during the dead of night when he went to pee and was killed by a fellow Marine. Lewis was the first person that was killed in the show, and it was a haunting reminder of how easy a life could be taken by mistake in that environment. It was said how they weren't sure if he said the password or not when approaching, and that sadly cost him his life. Lewis is actually one of only 2 medics that appears in the Pacific. In Band of Brothers, obviously Doc Eugene Rowe had a large focus, but in this series, that wasn't the case with the medics. Later on in the episode, we saw that the men were watching the naval fleets fighting one another, and there was a moment where one of the ships burst into flames completely. This was such a powerful shot. Not only did it look incredible, but you could only imagine how horrific it would have been to have been caught up in all of that. Within the entire Battle of Guadalcanal, the US lost 29 ships and the Japanese lost 38 ships. The next morning was when we saw that the US lost 4 cruisers during the night. Within real life, there were 8 cruisers that were lost over the course of the Guadalcanal campaign, 6 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers. In the show, it wasn't mentioned what ones were destroyed, but it was stated that due to what happened, it left them with half the ammo, food, and their medical supplies gone. So it already showed that due to being on an island, there were different consequences when compared to being in mainland Europe. At that point, they were now on their own. Alligator Creek. This is then where the final third of the episode took place. It was where we saw the first moments of battle occur. During the dead of night, the Japanese troops carried out an assault. However, they were wiped out by the American troops. This was something that did occur in reality. It was called the Battle of Tenaru. The Japanese troops lost 789 of the original 917 members, something which felt supported by the sheer amount of dead that was shown to us in the show. There were swarms of bullets that were flying around, 5 men were killed, and Skipper was panicking and was suffering due to the fear that he had within him during the assault. Going back to the sheer amount of Japanese troops that were dead, there was a line in the episode where they said they just kept on coming, and then Leckie referred to it as a real turkey shoot, something which Lou Jurgens said it was going to be when he got onto the island. This was something which showed the mindset of the Japanese troops. The culture was one which didn't praise surrender. Soldiers were expected to return home victorious or die in battle, so that's why they just kept on committing men. There was a moment where there was one Japanese troop that was left and the NCOs were playing with him, firing at him slowly and making him have a slow death, but Leckie put him out of his misery. Leckie seemed to be impacted by the sheer amount of death that was surrounding him at that moment compared to many others. The fact that he found a photo of a soldier's family and also a doll that was probably made for them by their kid, but now he was dead. It was a reminder that even though they were the enemy, they were humans as well, and with that comes family members who will mourn them following their death. The final moments of the episode pretty much saw the 7th Marines arriving in Guadalcanal for them to now partake in what Leckie had been doing, so the stories have now interlocked and we'll be seeing them coinciding a bit more. With it being Sid's birthday and just turning 18 a couple of weeks ago whilst he was out there, it showed that not only was he so young to be there, but also with them changing the lyrics to the song Happy Birthday, whilst it should have been a time for him to be celebrating, he could be embarking onto his last birthday due to the situation that he now found himself in. It was a harrowing way for the episode to finish when it faded to black. My review of the episode. I thought this was a good first episode of the show. It did a good job at immersing us into the world. It looked incredible. And granted, it's probably because it had a $250 million budget behind the entire series, but still, the scenes on the water were just phenomenal to look at. They were breathtaking, and it really felt like you were there. There was only one real point of action in the episode, and it occurred in the final third, but I think that was the right approach for them to take. The first 2 sections were all about introducing us to the conflict, why it was happening, what the intentions were, the characters, and then showing us the environment whilst they were out there. Then, in the final third, we had an amount of death that was unimaginable in such a short period of time, so it really got home the ruthless nature of it all. This episode was very much Leckie's episode. Despite being introduced to Sledge and Basilone, Leckie had more of the screen time. He's a character that I don't feel I learned that much about in this one episode, but there are plenty on the way for us to come to learn more. The brotherhood from the off isn't there in this show when compared to Band of Brothers, but with it not necessarily being focused on one specific company and everything that they go through, its intentions are probably quite different. The first episode of The Pacific was the most viewed one in the series, which doesn't really paint a good picture when it comes to the success of the show, but needless to say, it's a great opener to a powerful show. So, there you have it, my breakdown on the first episode of The Pacific. If you want to see breakdowns on Band of Brothers or Masters of the Air, then click on the card in the top corner. I've been covering every episode of Band of Brothers, and I'm now on to episode 8, so be sure to come back to see that. I'll also be covering every episode of The Pacific, so be sure to keep your eye out for episode 2. What do you think of the first episode? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.